Gentlemen, the time has come once again to discuss things.
Hi everyone, welcome to another episode of Geeky Gentlemen. I'm Sid Partu. Joining me today is...
A Geek for Fun.
And Steve.
And Steve, everybody's favorite. And Steve picked our discussion topic today. Steve, what are we discussing today?
Today we're talking about cereal.
Cereal.
I really like cereal, and I feel like everyone should eat cereal, but there's a lot of different ways to eat it, so I thought it'd be fun to just have a conversation about how you eat your cereal in the morning.
I'm a psycho. I put orange juice in it.
What the fuck is wrong with you? I was talking about, do you put milk in your cereal or not? What is this shit? I can't handle this. I changed my mind. We're not talking about cereal anymore. Ian, you've ruined it. Instead, we're going to talk about these really bizarre stories that I guess are best referred to as Dark Knight Returns stories or Unforgiven stories if you watch movies. These stories where central characters have aged up by like 20, 30 years, and now they're back for their last ride in a Mad Maxian sort of world.
Yeah. That's the funny thing, I guess, I hadn't thought of. It's always like the world's gone to shit, too.
Yep.
I didn't think about that detail. That is a very particular wrinkle.
Yeah, and part of my relationship with these stories has a lot to do with the way the world responds to the absence of the hero, which is why I think most of them are not very interesting. But so the way this topic came from is that our mutual friend on Twitter, King, he shot me a text the other day saying he read Old Man Logan for the first time, and he's like, I don't understand why everyone loves this story. And I hadn't thought about the fact that that story existed for years. Like, I know Old Man Logan's a thing, and I know he's got an ongoing, and Logan's based on it and whatever. But I hadn't thought about Old Man Logan, the comic, in years, literally since it came out, hence this idea popping up in my head. And I feel like I have an honest-to-goodness take about why Old Man Logan as a comic is kind of interesting. That isn't just my usual snarky bashing of everything that's popular. So the thing with Old Man Logan is, one, it's the first time Marvel's done a sort of prestige-style Dark Knight Returns story in their main book anyway, so it's a big deal for them. It happened in the middle of the Wolverine ongoing at the time in 2009, kind of like Batman Year One happened in the middle of the Batman book, which is cool on its own. It extrapolated from the present continuity, just like Dark Knight Returns did. So when you get to the end of that story, when Red Skull shows up and he's wearing Captain America costume, he's wearing Bucky Cap's costume, because that's what was happening at the time. So there's all these like weird, really particular Marvel in that moment isms that color Old Man Logan and make it kind of interesting to read, which is, I think, part of why people latched onto it so hard, because it was so weird and it kind of wasn't timeless, which inadvertently made it timeless. But the thing about that story, and the thing about every time we do this story, is that the premise is very much the same. The hero either does something they can't forgive, had something done to them that they couldn't forgive, or is simply too old, so they retire for a number of years. Usually it's anywhere from like 15 to 20. Then the world goes to shit in the meantime, and then they come back, and it's never really out of any sort of obligation to fix the world. It's almost entirely personally driven about what they need to end their life in a way that gives them closure. And sometimes that can be interesting. Like Logan the movie, I think, is really, really good. Unforgiven is a reasonably watchable Clint Eastwood movie, which is not a thing I can say about most of his movies, honestly. And Dark Knight Returns I don't like, but I can see why people like it. My problem with these stories, though, is they're built on the premise that the world is universally revolving around this one character, and then this one character can only build any sort of core sense of identity in relationship to how much power he exerts on the world. So Batman's search for a good death in Dark Knight Returns basically ends with him becoming a fascist insurgent. Old Man Logan basically just ends when Old Man Logan fucking murders everybody. Unforgiven basically ends the same way, where he just kind of fucking murders everybody. In fact, the only story in this kind of genre that I think is legitimately great is Daredevil End of Days, because it's the one time we don't do that.
Mm-hmm. You know, it's weird. I'm as you're talking about these, I'm trying to think of them, and it's funny that, like, I know we did an Old Man Hawkeye, and I know we did Old Man Quill over at Marvel. DC's, like, it's funny, DC technically created it with Dark Knight Returns and you know, your Kingdom Comes. But, like, they've even done versions of it now. I know there's Old Lady Harley, and I'm pretty sure it's Amanda Conner, so I'm pretty sure it's actually a parody, as far as Amanda Conner's writing allows, at least.
Yeah.
I don't know, maybe not. Maybe not. Maybe it's just art by Amanda Conner or something.
That's written by the guy that had a really brief Iron Man run, Frank something or other.
Yeah, Frank Tiere, Tiere. And maybe Conner did the covers, because that looks like an Amanda Conner cover, if I had to say anything. It's just, it's so weird that it has become such a thing. When did Kingdom Come out?
I'm gonna do a quick Google search because I think I know, but it's been so long. I'm bad with dates. It came out. Oh, that's the wrong thing. That's a video game. Kingdom Come Defiance came out in 2018. Okay, good to know. That's not what I'm talking about, though. Kingdom Come, the comic by Mark Waid, as we all know and have read, came out in 1996.
Okay, so yeah, you go 86 for Dark Knight Returns, 96 for Kingdom Come, and then Old Man Logan, you said, was 2009?
2009.
Yeah, that's quite a jump. I'm trying to think if there's anything else really notable in between those.
I think Spider-Man Reign came out in between those.
Spider-Man Reign came out between those. Marvel had a whole line of books called The End, which was basically this exact premise for a bunch of other superheroes that came out between those. Daredevil End of Days came out in 2012, I think. Watchmen sort of is this, except you don't do it with established heroes. But if you view it as a spiritual sequel to the characters that the Watchmen heroes are based on, then it is this. Trying to think of more. I should have written a list, because it's hard to do these right off the top of my head.
Well, like, it's funny because, like, DC does these ending of stories a lot better than I feel Marvel has, because I can name two right off the top of my head that are, like, legitimately, these are some of the best stories ever written in comics. Whatever Happened to the Man of Tomorrow, Whatever Happened to the Cape Crusader. Those are legitimately some of the best comic book stories.
Okay, I don't think those count.
Really?
Those are not these kinds of stories, though.
No,
right?
I get you. I'm talking about like these ending stories for the character.
Oh,
though.
I see. So like finales. Okay, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
And so like they do it so much better than okay, let's just make them old and we'll just go with the Dark Knight Returns trope, right? Because like even the Dark Knight Returns isn't that. Like that story ends with, oh no, Bruce is still alive and Superman knows, right? Like that's how Dark Knight Returns ends. It doesn't end with Bruce Wayne's death.
Right.
And that's like a very interesting point, I feel.
Yeah, I mean it subverts it almost. I guess I can't really subvert it since it sort of invented it, but it's one of the only ones that doesn't do that, and it's almost because you can't do that with Batman.
Mm-hmm.
Or at least you're not allowed to do that with Batman, especially when Dark Knight Returns was such a big deal when it came out.
Mm-hmm.
No, I'll give you that.
Yeah. I don't know, it's weird that like there's such this obsession with aging up the characters, and Frank Miller, you know, love him or hate him, whatever, his whole thing that he like fully admitted when he was writing Dark Knight Returns is he felt really insecure with the idea that he was older than Batman. And so he, through necessity, aged Batman up to deal with. And I'm like, no, that makes a lot of sense as like this kind of insecure thing of this idea of outliving your or out aging your childhood idol kind of thing. That makes a lot of sense to me. I don't know if you could maybe make an argument for Wolverine. I don't think like Star-Lord is anyone's childhood idol.
Yeah, what's with Old Man Star-Lord or Old Man?
Yeah, I don't know. I've not read it, so I feel bad talking about it almost.
That's
you know?
just the dumbest fucking idea.
Like, I don't even know what's going on in it. Like, it's just, maybe there's a story there. I can't like completely rag on it, but it does seem more like a cash-in than it does like an actual story, you know?
And I'm not saying that there isn't a story there. I'm just saying if you're going to take the branding of old man stories and just make a bunch of them, who the fuck cares about Peter Quill, old man?
Yeah, I mean, like, there's better characters that I'd like to see. And, you know, it's interesting because it's not like comics don't do this from time to time. Like, at the end of Hudlin's run on Black Panther, we skip, like, 20 years down the line where he's still married to Storm, and he's given up the mantle to Shuri, but he's still, like, kept the power of the Panther for himself, too. And so, like, Wakanda technically has 2 Black Panthers, but now he's just more of a statesman. And, like, that's a really interesting fucking ending there. It's not very, I guess, drama-heavy. It's just kind of like a cool little, like, utopian ending. I'm trying to think of others. Like, again, Kingdom Come, you got, like, Kingdom Come's probably the worst example of this, where everybody's quit, and then they all come back at once, you know?
Yeah,
That's
tell
just-
me that on. Sorry,
That's just DC Universe, The Dark Knight Returns.
Yeah, Dark
Like-
Knight Returns, the DC Universe.
Right.
Injustice is kind of that when you get to the sequel, yeah.
Yeah, I'm weird. Like, someone asked me a long time ago, like, what would you do for, like, a future DC universe? I'm like, I'd keep Wonder Woman immortal, so, like, she still looks like she does right now, but she's, like, you know, 150 years old, and everyone just looks up to her, because she's the last vestige of that era of superheroes. And so she's teaching all the new kids. She's teaching, like, John Kent's grandkid how to be a superhero. Like, I don't know, I think that's a kind of a cool-ass idea. So if you do technically, like, old lady Wonder Woman, she's still going to be, like, young in my mind, which would be really cool.
There's an episode of Batman the Brave and the Bold. It's the first one where Wonder Woman and Superman show up, and it opens with those 3 together having, like, a burger together. And it's hilarious because when Superman has a burger, he's got that great line where he's like, when I'm talking about truth, justice, and the American way, this is what I'm talking about. But at the end of that episode, it flashes forward like 20, 30 years, and they're at the same diner, and they're all old. Clark's got, like, little gray streaks, but he still looks like Clark. Wonder Woman's still Wonder Woman. And Bruce is just this decrepit old man in a wheelchair. And then something happens, like some criminal shows up, and they all suit up to battle, and Bruce just has, like, his wheelchair turned into a robotic bat suit.
I mean, if anyone was going to do it, right? Like, I still can't believe Batman Beyond didn't trick out that fucking cane at any point, right?
Or maybe he did and we just didn't see it.
Yeah, I know. Like, that feels like a wasted opportunity. Batman Beyond's another example of aging up a character, but that's one where I felt it was done in a really, really interesting way. Because Batman, like, quit as a failure, which is the most not Batman move ever, and then it takes, like, this young kid who's got that desperation in him to bring it back out of him and get him back in the game. I think that is, like, the best kind of version of this.
If you view the first episode, or I guess the first episode 2-parter, as one story and only one story, then that's probably the best of these stories ever.
Mm-hmm.
It's just so fucking good. Batman Beyond's first episode is arguably its best ever.
Oh no, absolutely. Like, it's got strong moments here and there, but nothing beats that initial premise. Maybe, all right, so if you do the first 2-parter, and then maybe like 1 or 2 episodes in between, and then the final 2-parter for the first season, then I think that's a pretty good Batman Beyond movie.
And Return of the Joker.
Yeah, or series of movies there. Like, the first 2-parters, movie 1, you take a couple episodes, and then season 1's finale is part 2. Because Blight has, like, that fucking great line. Who are you? I'll give you a hint. You killed my father. Do you have any idea how little that narrows it down? That is such a good fucking line.
That's so fucking good.
But like that kind of gives you. But like, what's interesting about Batman Beyond when you talk about it in this case of like the retired superhero is it's not about Bruce Wayne. It is mostly Terry's story, and Bruce Wayne is there as the mentor figure, right? So it's more a legacy, passing the torch kind of story.
Yeah, and I think that's its own sort of trope. Again, I like narrowing this down specifically to a hero retires, goes away for a while, world turns to shit, and then they come back themselves for one final adventure. In case Dark Knight Returns, there were sequels, but I don't think that really matters since that wasn't the intention to begin with. But that story, that archetype, Logan, Old Man Logan, Dark Knight Returns, Spider-Man Reign, Unforgiven, I guess arguably Mad Max, any of the Mad Max movies, but you know what I mean.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's interesting, Steve, because I was thinking this one as well, but I was going to ask you if it fit. And the fact that you mentioned it outright is curious because this is the hardest stretch, I feel, because it's almost inherently different. Is Daredevil End of Days is very much about that story already happened.
Yep. That's why
and this is like it's as if like the entire rest of the book is just people trying to figure out what the fuck happened in that story that we never got to see. I don't know if you ever read it because it was in the Mark Waid room, but like Daredevil: The King in Red is a lot closer to Daredevil's Dark Knight Returns because it actually follows Matt Murdock as a older, and I like that ending for it. But the fact that we've got two different takes on this very specific trope for Daredevil, I think works for him very well. I think it works for stuff like Batman and Wolverine because these are these characters that are always inherently broken by the failures of their lives and having to pick up the pieces. Batman may be the least so of both of them, but all of them inherently have this kind of thing of they're stuck in an internal war where everything's always going to go to shit for them just because that's how their stories are built. So kind of taking that to the apex makes a lot of sense because you then get to see, okay, what's the furthest extreme we can push this? How fucked can we make Batman's life? Like, do we make it to the point where he has to become a fascist? Or do we make it to the point where he literally can't be Batman anymore because he fucked it up so badly and he has to get someone else? Wolverine, you can do that. Wolverine literally, his always fears of losing control of Berserker Rage, he literally killed the X-Men. Like, where do you go from there after that? Daredevil, he just fucking snapped and just Kingpin's just gone. And this is the consequences for that. Those all make sense. When you try and apply it to someone like Peter Quill, which is ridiculous, or Harley Quinn, which is ridiculous, or even the one that's like more infamous just for, again, it's got the name recognition more than those two, but still, why the fuck would you do this with Spider-Man?
Yeah, Spider-Man Reign is so weird. I don't understand that story. So I haven't read it in years, but when I did read it, I couldn't tell if it was being serious or not the whole time.
Mm-hmm.
It's so preposterously bizarre. Do you know like the basis premise behind that story, Ian? Have you read it?
No idea.
Okay,
You're asking me a Marvel question. Come on the fuck on. You know me better.
That's why I asked. So it's I don't remember who writes it. It's this 4-issue miniseries. It is literally Dark Knight Returns in that way. It's really, really specifically like a post 9/11 kind of story, even though it came out several years after 9/11. But Spider-Man's old. He's like 60 or something. Mary Jane has died. Their kid has died. Their kid dies, right? Yeah. No. The kid,
part of the plot is they couldn't have a kid. And that's...
Right. They couldn't have a kid, and she dies because his semen is radioactive.
Yeah.
It's really weird, and I couldn't take that story seriously at all, and I think it kept trying to ask me to. There was even like a weird specific moment where like Spider-Man and Green Goblin are just old, so they just kind of like sit down in the middle of their fight because they're tired. I don't understand that story, and and you're right, Alfie. It's so bizarre that someone thought to do that for a fucking Spider-Man of all characters.
It's just when you establish this, I guess like anything in comics. Whenever someone's got a good idea or like a very timely idea or a very poignant idea for a character, Like we mentioned, this doesn't really fit, but I think it's a good example anyway, because people's tried to copy this as well. Is when Moore did Whatever Happened to the Man of Tomorrow, he was doing a very personal story about his views on Superman and that era of Superman ending, and that his childhood version of Superman was going away now. So you can read a lot of that into it. We've mentioned like Frank Miller, he was doing a thing because he felt very insecure about Batman aging up. These are all very personal stories about a character that's larger than life, that I think fit the kind of weight you want to touch on that, because I feel like if you are going to do a storyline of the world's gone to shit, here's Bruce Wayne dealing with that, and very specifically in a time where Adam West was the main draw to a lot of people for just the public consciousness. So the way that book's framed, it's as if this is Adam West after he retired and he's coming back now, and this is the world everything's gone to shit. Like it works in that, it's why it made such a big splash. Logan, I think, kind of had that as well, because the Wolverine movies and the X-Men movies were just so big in the pop culture that even though the book kind of got a reputation, when the movie came out, it exploded, just because there was like a culture that understood Wolverine as he was, and then showing him at the end, it was like shocking. It was like, whoa, okay, this is this, but it made sense. Applying it broad strokes to everything as if it was like a tie-in event, as if this is just like here's the tie-in comics to depressing and sad the event. Like it just doesn't
Steve
work.
by everyone. Yeah, I think you're really on to something where it's incredibly marketable. We talk about this a lot, where love it or hate it, Dark Knight Returns changed the game forever, right? Like comic books would be completely different now if Dark Knight Returns had never happened. If we still got Watchmen, if we still got like Killing Joke, if we still got all the other like major books that have happened since Dark Knight Returns, if we didn't have Dark Knight Returns, I don't think it would be the same that it is today. Because everything's kind of a reaction to Dark Knight Returns, whether it's an affirmation or a rejection. Like, even in subtle ways. It's absolutely the case with everything with Batman, but, like, things have to try, like, kind of define themselves by Dark Knight Returns of, like, no, this is going to be, like, more fun and uplifting, unlike Dark Knight Returns, or, oh, no, this is going to be brutal and serious, just like Dark Knight Returns. Cough, Spawn, cough. I don't... God, that cough, I got to get that taken care of. Like, that's... Everything's such a reaction to it. And so once you run out of things to kind of like react to and try to like let that type of storytelling take hold but not change the status quo as drastically as that does, once you've kind of run out of things to do with that, I think it kind of ends at a logical place where it's like, okay, so we've kind of run out of things, but it's been like 10 years, so let's do it again. First it was Batman, now it's the entire Justice League, and Hal Jordan just sits in a fucking satellite orbiting Earth, protecting it but never coming down. And I'm like, that's a terrible Green Lantern. Wait, shit, yeah. Is it Hal Jordan or is it Alan Scott?
It's Hal Jordan, I think.
It is? Okay, it's been a long time since I've read Kingdom Come. Like, that's a shitty job for a Green Lantern, but I guess. And then you got, like, Superman just goes to the Fortress of Solitude and makes a farm and lets superheroes just kill each other left and right. And I'm like, this is
and
a
then
weird
also
premise.
becomes a fascist. Like, there's a trend here.
I think they're kind of like inherently fascistic. Like they have elements of it, and it's just how hard you want to let them lean into that, right?
I think we did an entire episode on this about the whole balance between being a power fantasy and being empowering.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But I'm glad we're on to this, because based on what you said and based on what Alfie said a minute before that, I want to ease into this point because I know how it sounds. But I think I am onto something, and I think it's important because comic books have a history of this, and that's part of why I had such a weird break from them and then returned to them. So, Frank Miller writes Dark Knight Returns, and like you said, he couldn't relate to Batman in part because he was so much older than Batman, and so he ages him up and writes this story about his very specific, very masculine insecurities as a person. You get to Spider-Man Reign in like 2007, 2006, whatever, and it's a very particular story about Peter Parker, who's not only lost everything, but very much isn't quote unquote the man he used to be. That even in the most literal sense, his semen's the thing that kills his wife. Right? Like, it's so on the nose, but it's there, right? So you go to Unforgiven, and what Clint Eastwood's character is as a manly man gets called into question immediately with the kid who asked him for a job, or asked him to do a job with him. And like, there's very particular imagery here of like, oh wow, is he a bad father? Is he a bad husband? Is he not man enough to do a particular thing? Yada, yada, yada. Old Man Logan, same thing, right? With his family getting killed, the way the Hulk family exists. There's like a really particular sort of obsession with how manly can you be, and have you lost your manliness in your old age, and how do you express it and reclaim it again by using brute force? Because that's all they end up doing. I'm not saying that's the only thing in these stories, but all of them seem to conveniently revolve around this idea of, here's a man that doesn't feel like a man, and here he is beating people up until he feels like a man again. So much so that there's an entire plot point about this in Watchmen, with Night Owl, which is preposterous to me, but here we are. The problem I have with a lot of superhero comics post Dark Knight Returns and post Watchmen, and the problem I have with a lot of comic book culture, is that comic books were very much designed and were very much read by disenfranchised people, by people that were geeks or nerds or weirdos, and so they gravitate towards the geeks, the weirdos, and the freaks in comic books, right? You don't have any friends, you go home and pick up an issue of Batman. That's fine. They started trending in a different direction, where the disenfranchised started reading stories like Dark Knight Returns, where their masculinity had been called into question. You're not a real man because you're a geek that reads comic books. You're hyper emasculated because you do this. So here's a story where you can tackle that issue, and you tackle it by exerting a very particular kind of violence outward. And so the narrative kind of shifts, and you get to what we have now culturally with stuff like The Big Bang Theory, where you just drop all this casual sexism all the time, because now, instead of having disenfranchised people going to comics to feel less disenfranchised, it's the people in comics that start disenfranchising other people because they just don't get it. And so you see all the people that say, you don't get it, Watchmen's art. You don't get it, Dark Knight Returns is art. And a lot of that, I think, parallels or runs concurrent with this idea that here's the masculine hero whose masculinity is called into question, so he beats you up until he feels like it isn't.
Mm-hmm.
And I really take a problem with that.
No, I think you're absolutely right. And it's one of those things where I think Frank Miller would agree with you if you told him, so you're just writing a Batman story where he goes through a midlife crisis.
Yes.
I don't think he's, like, trying to keep that part of the story secret, because
Frank Miller is, like, out and out. Frank Miller is misogynistic, but he's out and out said things where he says he knows it and he doesn't care.
Nah, I mean, it's not fine, but it's at least you can work with that. You know who you're dealing with. He's
honest,
not bullshitting you. Yeah, he's not bullshitting you, which is, you got to be at least thankful for that. So you get stuff like that, and I'm like, so yeah, he kind of just admits that he's writing Batman going through a midlife crisis in order to deal with his own midlife crisis. And that's totally fine and understandable. And if you want to express violence at outrage of being less manly, there's definitely worse ways to do it than through fiction. I think the problem becomes that it, like you said, it gets picked up by people who aren't actually going through a midlife crisis, but are just going through a general crisis of masculinity and are viewing this as the only way to cope with that,
Right.
Because, I think there's a world of difference between writing violence to cope and reading violence to cope. Would you agree with that?
I absolutely agree with that. And that's why I think that sort of the lessons we're supposed to learn from Watchmen and Dark Knight Returns are not the ones we ended up learning, like Grant Morrison's always a fan of saying. I think that there's a really particular reason we went from Watchmen the comic book to Zack Snyder making the Watchmen movie, which, like, love it or hate the comic or love or hate the movie misses a lot of what the comic was trying to say, even if I don't like what the comic's trying to say. And then that guy makes Man of Steel and Batman versus Superman. And that makes total sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because that guy just sees the violence and the brutality as, like, cool. Like, you know, Frank Miller, he's good at, like, the ultra violence and brutality, but, like, he's very much trying to make some kind of point with it, whether good or bad. He's honestly doing it for more than, oh, it'll be really cool to have Batman shoot a Nazi. Like, he's going for some. Whereas Zack Snyder's like, oh, it'll be really cool to have Batman shoot this guy that's about to kill Superman's mom. Like, that's all the thought that is put into that scene. God damn it.
Yeah, I mean, you look at the opening scene of Batman versus Superman, and Joe Chill has his gun, and he puts the pearls around the trigger and shoots her in the fucking face for what reason?
Because then it's more brutal, Steve.
Yes, because it's a cool shot, and it sends completely the wrong message, but it looks cool.
Mm-hmm.
But that's part of why I wanted to talk about this, because I think there's a whole general sweeping area of comic book culture that is exceptionally toxic that comes from the way comic books have been written for a really long time. But I think that there's an important sort of misdirection happening here of, like you said, here's a person who has a midlife crisis and writes a story about a character having a midlife crisis. Here's a person that doesn't actually want to grow up and then pretends like their midlife crisis is relatable. Like, there's a very different situation from, I feel awkward in middle school, so I'm going to read Dark Knight Returns?
Mm-hmm. You know, it's funny.
That's how I solved that problem?
You know, it's funny, we're talking about all this, and you know what storyline just wrapped up in the Flash books? Is Flash Year One. And that should have almost nothing to do with this conversation because it's
literally the
one.
opposite of the
It's
conversation.
an origin. But here's the thing. So Joshua Williamson did kind of an interesting, and you can really only get away with it with the Flash. He reinvented Flash's origin as a time loop and used the Turtle as the main villain. So I'll try to do Flash bullshit science real quick here. The Turtle is immortal, and he has the power to actually slow time if he can get enough energy to do it. And he wants to use the Flash as a battery. He manages to steal a little bit of energy from Flash to start it, but he can only localize it to Keystone City, or Central City, whatever. And he puts the city under what he calls the shell, because he's the turtle. Get it? Anyway, so Barry gets his powers early on and doesn't really know what he's doing and is testing them out and accidentally jumps into the future where he meets Old Man Barry.
Ooh, interesting.
And Old Man Barry has to teach him how to be the Flash, even though this is an Old Man Barry who has lived his entire life not as the Barry Allen superhero member of the Justice League that we know, but the Barry Allen always just escaping at the last second and trying to help where he can in this dystopian city that is controlled by the Turtle. So he has to teach, you know, fresh off the boat Barry Allen how to do things. And like the example of that is, how do you stop without falling on your face? And he's like, I slide into it. And like, that's kind of a cool little trope. But then what's really, really interesting is how this story concludes, where, you know, early days Barry goes back to his own time and he beats up the Turtle and he thinks he's solved the time loop. But of course it doesn't work because Old Man Turtle and Old Man Barry come back and he's trying to create this big time loop thing. And Old Man Barry's like, yeah, listen, kid, I told you all those things because it's what I told myself when I was you. I don't know how many times we've done this. If I had to guess, it'd be infinite. We're always in this loop. We're always stuck in this way. So just never let him catch you until today. And then that present day Barry Allen says, fuck that noise, and actually goes and saves the day, breaks the time loop. Which is a really fun kind of Flash way to do a new take on the origin. I kind of dug it.
This is unrelated, but I kind of love that he just made Barry Allen's origin story an inversion of Bart Allen's origin story. That's kind of amazing.
It's kind of cool.
The exact same premise, but in reverse.
It's cool, man. So yeah, just that idea though that like you've got the like trope of here's the character old, but they're going out for like that one last hurrah. And like you kind of think that's what it's gonna end up being, but no, it's like it's the old man who's just too pathetic to do anything about it. It's the young man who has to kind of pick up and say, "No, old timer, I'm gonna fix it." And that's, I don't know, there's something interesting that's playing with these tropes, but I feel arguably doing something much different, right? So
I like that. That's a really good twist on the situation because it's not the world depends on the main character.
Except that it does, right? Like, it's not that the world depends on the old man of the main characters. The world depends on that, like, that bright-eyed optimism of the main character when he's young and starts being a hero.
Right. I mean, like, it doesn't have the same sort of, like, linear focus that something like Dark Knight Returns does, where Batman quits, world goes to shit. It's not that.
Exactly. It's you know, resigning himself to his fate is what let the world go to shit. It's about picking up the optimism, which I feel, again, we have been, you know, reacting to Dark Knight Returns for 30 years in comics at this point.
I think technically now it's 40.
Yeah, 40 fucking years.
Jesus Christ, we're old.
Yeah, you know, there's been a reaction to it, and at this point we still are, but when you get stories like that, it's like, yeah, it's a reaction, but it's almost a rejection. And I feel like the rejection is coming up more and more. Again, I haven't read Old Lady Harley, but to parrot it, if it's not a parody, then what the fuck are they doing? To parody Dark Knight Returns is something that I think is genuinely worthwhile, you know? I
mean, I have no problem with parodying Dark Knight Returns. My problem is only really starts to stem when Dark Knight Returns becomes the only Batman story we tell, which is kind of what happened the last 3 or 4 years. Where like we're bombarded year after year after year with Dark Knight Returns adaptation, whether it was literal or not. And then I think Zack Snyder trying to do it in Batman vs. Superman is finally the thing that broke us away because we realized how dumb this was.
Yeah, I mean, Lego Batman movie wouldn't be the same without that.
This is true.
And that is very much not Dark Knight Returns. That is, you know, your typical... I mean, not typical, but that is your Robin origin in a number of ways.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
I think that's another, like, the trope of we're taking the Dark Knight Returns character, but we're also giving him the younger, wide-eyed next generation alongside that, be it Logan or Terry McGinnis or the Robin or even the younger version of himself. That seems to be the more... I mean, I guess Carrie Kelly maybe fits that role, but she's a lot more passive in that she's just there to serve Bruce. She's not like they're going to be the... And obviously later on she becomes Batwoman with the future sequels, but we don't talk about those. Yeah, so like there's stuff like that. Like again, Daredevil End of Days is entirely about the next generation of that after Matt Murdock's already dead at the start of the story. So that's a different kind of trend and something I feel like fits for the nature of superhero comics, where we can do the finales of these characters, but we're acknowledging that these characters are like what they represent or what stories they're trying to tell are immortal, even if the characters are flesh and blood. Like All-Star Superman, even that, which Superman doesn't even die at the end, he's implied to be coming back because he's going to do the DC 1 million shit. But even that is like at the end, the future is, oh, don't worry, we've got the code to make another one. We know how to make another Superman. That's the next generation. So there's a lot of...
Superman.
Yeah, Superman. He's even got the 2 on the logo, which is great. So it's just some of those ideas I think help make it less so this misogynistic, like huge masculine, like I need to get back my wasted youth. I need to prove I'm still as good as I was back then, or I'm even better now because I'm a chiseled old bastard who knows how the world really works, kid. That is subverted a lot of the time once we get the kid who knows how the world actually works more than the old man, which I think was the big strength of Logan. Is Laura is the one who gets Logan to fucking wake up and snap out of it, and actually by the end of it she's the one who's going to be heading off into the future to do that. It's like that helps balance where you can tell this story about an old man feeling insecure without making the own solution, oh, he wins it because he beats people up. It's no, because he managed to impart his lessons without his baggage.
Yeah, absolutely. That's the best thing about Logan, is that Logan is very much about him breaking character and him breaking from the tradition he established. It's not him trying to reclaim anything. It's him trying to just save the future and redeem the world for its past. And it's great. It's nice and mythological in its own way.
Yay.
It's also just very sad.
Yeah,
Yeah.
we love the sad ones. I think it's interesting though, because there is something to that. I guess Old Lady Harley's the only example I can think of, but we do only do this with guys. We've had countless endgame last stories of Batman and Superman. You can count like endlessly. Basically every other arc is the last Superman story. But we never do this with Wonder Woman, like at all. And I think that's pretty telling.
Because writers are intimidated by him and they don't know how women deal with midlife crises.
Well, yeah, but that's the exact thing, right? Like the idea that men have masculine crises is itself a consequence of how men think they need to be, that they think their life has to go in a certain direction, that they have to be manly in a certain way, and then you get to a certain point where you realize those expectations are hollow, but you don't have the tools to actually emotionally unpack that baggage, so you just get mad at everything and have like a terrible shitty midlife crisis and become this weird beefy Dark Knight Returns dude who beats the crap out of people. Whereas if you're in a situation where you've just been historically oppressed and written out of stories and you're just a cannon fodder for most of your male characters, you don't have time to have midlife crises. More often than not, you're learning the lessons of having to deal with a harsh world consistently and concurrently. Wonder Woman's not a character that ever needs to have a midlife crisis. At the same time, though, I kind of wish we did more of a, here's what Wonder Woman was up to while Bruce was having his weird breakdown in Dark Knight Returns and embarrassing himself in a Batman costume at 60.
Well, what she was up to was... Oh, no, that was Catwoman dressed up like Wonder Woman
Yes.
in DK2. God, that shit was so fucking confusing.
Part of it's the art, but yes.
Yeah, but I mean, just... That's a bad choice. She's in, like, 2 panels. Fucking, what the hell? You know, it's funny, I'm sitting there trying to rack my brain of stories that do this, where we get, like, the old version of it. Hey, guess what Ian's gonna talk about? It's the book he almost never mentions, ever. DC Comics Bombshells!
Ding, 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 ding. It's that time of week again, folks.
Well, like, I love that series. The final arc, it's clearly that they canned the book, and Margaret Bennett was like, well, I'm gonna give it the ending. Even if I have to scrunch it into one story arc, I'm gonna do the ending. And so the end of that series is Selina Kyle takes on a ward in a young Bruce Wayne to train him to be a hero because he was inspired by a generation of female heroes that were the Bombshells. So you have old lady Selina kind of training young Bruce Wayne, which is a weird thing to think about, particularly because I was reading, you know, that at the same time as Tom King's Batman run. but like that's one of the only examples I think of where it's like an old lady version of a character and what she's gonna spend her future doing. God, I'm racking my brain on this one. Batman Beyond 2.0. If we want to talk about old lady Wonder Woman, Batman Beyond 2.0, set in the DCAU. So Wonder Woman in that, since she never showed up in Batman Beyond, she went over to the Justice Lords universe to be with that Batman, and they tried to make a better world over there, and it kind of went to shit all Injustice style is pretty much the best thing I can say about that situation.
So this answer might kind of be cheating, but I think it works. But there's 2 people in this film where it works for both of them, and I think it's kind of perfect and it fits this theme. But Last Jedi, with Rey being the Terry McGinnis foil with Luke, and then Leia being old woman Leia.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
It's exactly this trope, and Leia, unlike Bruce, does not have a midlife crisis. She's matured, she's had the exact same lessons, she becomes an inspiration to other people, she teaches them how to carry on and have hope. And then Rey sees all the failings of Luke, and instead of just being his ward, breaks from the tradition.
Mm-hmm.
It's almost like the female characters handle this situation way better than the men do.
Oh, man. Steve, are you trying to inject like feminist politics onto geeky gentlemen?
I am doing no such thing. I am waving a flag of feminist politics in the Geeky Gentleman.
Oh man. Yeah, I don't know. It's like it is like it. Something to consider is, of course, that women also have crises of age. They do also worry about aging and not being seen in a particular way. I think what's worth saying about that, though, is it happens a whole hell of a lot earlier for women because of how much society enforces ideas of youthfulness. Like, I think women go through this in their mid-20s into their 30s a lot of the time, more than men who wait till like their 50s and 60s, right?
I'll raise you even more. I feel like women go through this when they're like in their teens.
Okay.
I think that you're literally enculturated into it from a very young age, where like middle school and high school are all about very particular ideas of what it means to be masculine and what it means to be feminine. For men, it's just do the thing you've always been doing. For women, it's become the thing that fits in with what men have always been doing. And then there's reaction points to it over the course of their lives, and you can tell a really good, interesting, complex story about how women deal with this. But for that, you'd have to have more than like 3 women write comics.
Yeah, and I mean, it's not that like that leaves it on an awkward point because I was about to read something, but it's written by a man, so fuck it. I'm just gonna go with it. It's not like the ideas of the indoctrination of a male society haven't been dealt with in comics and like trying to reaffirm and create positivity for females. So I'm going to read this excerpt from Wonder Woman Earth 1 Volume 2, where Wonder Woman is teaching a college class and is doing a Q&A session. There's a lot of stuff on social media about how you dress provocatively and promote an unrealistic body type, which is basically setting a bad example for women. I mean, the stuff you do is amazing and all, it's just, does any of that criticism bother you? I don't think there's any such thing as an unrealistic body shape. My own body is the result of diet, exercise, and sophisticated genetic engineering. Otherwise, I dress as I please. I think that is a very important point. And I can't tell you the number of times I've read particularly Wonder Woman comics. Wonder Woman is very much geared toward that idea of acceptance as you are. That is all over Wonder Woman books. There's tons of issues about that of acceptance of the female form and not letting yourself be seen in the eyes of the masculine image. That I think she's really good at dealing with that. It's just done in such a positive way that you can't really tell a story about it because Wonder Woman's just like so good at shutting that shit down in an instant. Like it's hard to tell a whole story around that little interaction. That's just a really good interaction, and that's tends to be what Wonder Woman does. Just give great fucking advice to help people deal with those perceptions that have been created in a patriarchal world.
No, I think there's pretty much summed up where you can go with that. Maybe that's why less the example, because again, it's such a trend. I feel like people barely need an excuse to write these things. They just seem to just throw them out. So maybe a lesser writer would have tried to pitch like a Wonder Woman story like that, but given what you said, you're probably right. There might not be as much meat in the tank for it in terms of just a deconstruction of the character, I guess, because she's basically fine. We just need to keep building her up because we've been keep changing her so often. There's barely a time to talk about old Wonder Woman when we give her a new young Wonder Woman origin every other story.
Like, I mean, can we just get a handle on Wonder Woman's age? Sometimes she's 18, sometimes she's 1800. I just want that.
Yeah. I feel like something interesting about that, and it's related to Wonder Woman, so it was segue into this, but this is more so to these kind of stories being so popular and so influencing in comics that I think causes another kind of problem, where the moment Dark Knight Returns came out and it was characterized as a Batman who had been through the shit and a Batman who had had no social interaction for a decade and was completely off his game, and that's why he acts the way he does in that is the justification. It's not meant to be. Even Miller wrote Batman at year one is not the same Batman in Dark Knight Returns. It's very clear it's meant to be exaggerated characterization. People just fucking took it as that's how Batman is.
Yep.
And then the same thing, Wonder Woman. Kingdom Come comes out and is deliberately meant to be, oh, this is how bad things have gotten, where Wonder Woman's now got a sword and is killing people. But no, that just stuck.
Kurt Busiek had a tweet storm about this a little while back, where he's like, everyone's just sort of obsessed with doing Batman and Wonder Woman and Superman at these particular points in their histories and popular stories, not realizing that it took a certain amount of time for them to get there. Ed Brubaker does this when he writes Batman. Mark Waid does this when he writes Superman, where it's always this one particular voice in this one particular time period, and none of the growth is ever there. This is partly why Grant Morrison and Tom King's Batman runs are so much better, because you actually see from issue 1 to issue 100 where this person is going, and it's not just pulling from this one period in time, acting as if it's the eternal voice of the character.
Mm-hmm. And that's what I love about like Grant Morrison's run, is it does every decade of Batman comics is like a year or two of this guy's life. You know, that does so much good for the character.
Yeah.
To see him as that progression of ideas. And I don't know, if you tried to do that with Wonder Woman, it'd be terribly inconsistent. It's like, oh yeah, I'm gonna fit in and be the Justice Society's secretary for a year. I'm gonna pine after Steve Trevor for a year. Ugh, Christ.
So many of these problems and so much of what you could do with these kind of Dark Knight Returns style stories would be alleviated if there was just more diverse blood in the comic writing process to begin with. I mentioned this in one of the videos I did more recently, where I said, I'm really grateful that Brian Michael Bendis made Miles Morales, but I'd really wish there were more people of color who were actually writing Miles Morales.
Right? Like, it's crazy to look at everything Dwayne McDuffie did with, like, the Milestone universe, you know?
Exactly.
And just, like, how much creativity for urban voices came out of that, and diverse voices. And, you know, again, it's not just, oh, he created black superheroes. He created a gay superhero. What the hell? Where was that going to come from anywhere else in existence?
And where was
especially at that era.
And when else was it going to have a voice that was authentic and true to those experiences, that didn't just sound like the writer heard a story from one of their friends?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Batman's never been written by a woman. Like, that still really bothers me, that we've had 80 years of Batman comics and we don't have a single, like, sustained run written by a woman.
Yeah, because, like, Gail Simone's only done, like, arcs here and there in Detective at best.
Yeah, she's done arcs here and there at best. Devin Grayson had a run on Nightwing, which is not really the same thing. And for a lot of people, it was the worst run in Nightwing, and it got cut off because of, I think, Infinite Crisis. I don't remember exactly. So no, we haven't had any sort of like sustained long run. Here's one woman's take on Batman over a long period of time. We haven't even had that with Batwoman.
Oh no, that's not true.
Is that not true? I know Greg.
Margaret Bennett did an 18-issue Batwoman run.
Okay, that's fair. I didn't read that.
It's fantastic.
That's good to know.
Yeah. Okay, so here's a question that's not really related to the topic, but kind of sort of as far as this diverse creators thing. What do you feel is more important? I think the obvious answer is both, Ian, but just what do you feel is more important? That we get diverse voices on diverse characters. You know, we get more women to write Wonder Woman. We get more women to write Batwoman. We get more women to write, I don't know, Lady Shiva. I'm trying to think of female characters. Do you think it's more important that we get that, or that we get more women and people of color to write established mainline characters, like getting more women and people of color on like Green Lantern and Superman and stuff? I think the obvious answer is, well, both, but which, if you have to choose one?
So, yes, the obvious answer is obviously both. But I think with the way comics are right now, and if you wanted like an actual practical solution to this problem, you would go with the latter. Because the problem I have is anytime we do anything that's trying to diversify a mainstay character, the obvious resort is, why would you make Peter Parker gay? Why don't you just go create a gay character? Or something along those lines. That somehow the racial identity that's just bare bones, vanilla, white, straight dude is somehow an identity unto itself, even though it's not. So in a world where that's the case, if you just get a bunch of characters written by diverse voices that are already diverse, the best thing you're going to end up doing is appealing to a lot of people that are disenfranchised, which is good, but also segmenting off that part of the comic book community and just exacerbating the issue. If more people saw a female voice writing Batman, if more people were exposed to a Batman that was gay or that was black or that was really any number of things except straight, white, and boring, you would have to force the people who are committed to reading Batman and Superman and whoever else to face those issues and to see those issues. There are people that will buy every single issue of Superman that ever comes out, and if the Superman comic was for the first time written by a woman and was still selling the same pace it was always going to sell, and they finally got exposed to certain ideas that they don't have the luxury of ignoring anymore because now it's in their source material, then suddenly you're doing a whole lot more good. But then even on top of that, the bigger issue is Tom King gets death threats all the time for what he's done on Batman. You can't imagine the kind of shit that someone would get through if there was a woman writing Batman. It would be that times 10. And if the comic industry had any sort of balls whatsoever, and they got a woman to write Batman and actually change the culture of their offices and force the online community, that discourse they control, to take up for this writer that they've given a platform and a voice to, so much would change overnight. Like, could you imagine if you got Gail Simone to write Batman, and then the comic book industry as a whole came together and say, look, if you talk shit about Gail Simone on her Batman run, we disown you. That is a massive power move.
Yeah. It's a nice dream.
100%. It's one of those things where just because of how these characters are built up, and probably why we get stories like the Dark Knight Returns style thing, is just because the way the industry is formed, the characters that are going to stick around and be pushed the most are the ones that were in those early days, that were in the Batmans, your Supermans, your Wonder Womans, your Spider-Mans, your Fantastic Four, your Hulks. Like, all these characters, making new characters of good, like you get hits now and again, like Luke Cage and Miles Morales. Even then, Miles Morales is backing off of the Spider-Man lore. It's just so much harder and so less direct to the people who are reading the books and what they consider to be the true version of the universe, rather than, oh, this is a gimmick, this is they're just trying to add diversity kind of thing. That's the excuse they always use. So I feel like that's a really good point to make, just because although we want both, I feel if you do the latter, you're going to get the first one anyway, because that's just going to spin off from that.
No, I definitely agree. I do want to give a little bit of credit where it's due and talk about some characters that were created by diverse voices to fill these needs. So I already mentioned like Dwayne McDuffie creating Static Shock. I think that's a very important thing. G. Willow Wilson creating Kamala Khan. I think that's a pretty big deal there too. I'm trying to think of others where it's like diverse voice creating the thing as opposed to white guy creating the diverse voice, because that's like helpful at the very least.
Keenan Kong.
Oh, there you go. Yeah. So like I think it's one of those things where it's worth mentioning that it happens. It just needs to be happening more. And like, you know, you were mentioning Miles Morales earlier. Obviously, the other one that's a Bendis creation, Ironheart.
Yeah.
Rory Williams. There we go.
Yeah.
God, that was a hard pull for me for a second. Obviously, she didn't take off in the same way because she was created in an era where the racists in the comics community we're starting to get really defensive of creating diverse characters. So she wasn't given the chance to take off in the same way Miles did. But like, while it's important to get those diverse characters, even if they're created by people outside of those communities, I do think that it's fair to say that we're getting more of diverse characters created by diverse voices now than we ever have, which is like both a good thing and a little bit sad because it is still pretty damn sparse. I don't know.
And I think also importantly, we're diversifying things that have always been there that we didn't do before. So as badly as it was handled, Iceman being gay is nice. Spider-Verse, Into the Spider-Verse being handled and made the way it was is very, very nice. Ironheart didn't go over as well as, like you said, as people wanted it to, but the sort of consequences it had for like the larger scale of the Iron Man world is really nice. Luke Cage and Jessica Jones being a big deal is really nice. Particularly,
Nadia Van Dyne. She's a pretty cool female character. She's probably in my top 10 Marvel characters.
Yeah.
Yeah. Sorry to interrupt. I just wanted to throw in another one.
No, you're good. But yeah, no, there is good happening. It's happening slowly, and I think it's not happening in the right places, but it's happening. The two big areas comics really need to focus on to improve this sort of culture is they need to start controlling their social media traction more. Because so much of this is trolling, so much of this is bad hashtags, so much of this is messaging death threats to creators. DC and Marvel really need to work harder at making the writers that they sign on feel like they're safe and they have a voice and they can tell honest stories. And we just don't do that, and we don't do that historically because comic book companies don't care about their creators. If they did, we wouldn't have the myriad of copyright issues that we did.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, in all fairness, not universally across the board, some of them are kind of dickish. Like, Sean Gordon Murphy is a weird guy. I have a really hard time pinning that dude down. But, like, by and large, what I see a lot on social media is the direct creatives involved do not tolerate that shit. Mm-hmm. When they see it, it's just that the companies themselves tend to tolerate it.
Well, yeah, so this is the thing, right? So there was an article that was released on The Guardian recently about the relationship to fascism and the birth of the golden age of the superheroes. And in that article, they basically call Donald Trump Orange Skull because it's about Marvel, and so it's Orange Skull, and that's cutesy and funny. And Marvel basically disowned the article and went to The Guardian because they didn't want that out in the public. Also, food for thought, the guy who owns Marvel, not like Disney, but the guy who owns Marvel is a Trump supporter who's given a lot of money to the Trump campaign. So that's a problem.
Oh, surprise.
I know. Everyone should know this. It's not that hard if you just do your Google searching. But like that guy, that structure, that's a problem. And so, like, yeah, the creators do a really good job of rallying around each other and protecting each other, and that's good. The companies don't do anything to return the favor with the way those creators have worked, and it's not like comic book writers have a union or anything. God knows what you mean, it would be great. I know. But so like another really good example of this is like Rick Remender was writing for Marvel for a really long time. He had a great Venom run. He had a halfway really good Captain America run. He did a lot of fun stuff over at Marvel, and then he quit and started doing his own creator things after his contract ended. And after he was asked how he felt about his time at Marvel, he said, it made sure my family had health insurance and I got paid. And that was the extent of how he felt about his time there. And a lot of that's because the way the company relates to its talent isn't beneficial. And you're going to get this across the board with every comic book company. And if there was more work actually being done within the industry themselves, where the writers don't have to feel like they need to rally with each other because they have someone else they can talk to, maybe we get more diverse voices and more things going out there. I really appreciate Bendis giving us Luke Cage. I really appreciate him giving us Alias. I really appreciate him giving us Miles Morales. All of those stories are really important. The Luke Cage TV show, at least the first half of season 1, is a godsend. Jessica Jones' story with Purple Man is fantastic, but that's not your place.
Mm-hmm. Shouldn't that story be told by someone who's lived it?
Right.
That's the thing. I laughed because it is really funny to think about at the idea of a comic book union, and I'm gonna go controversial leftist opinion. I think a comic book union for writers and artists would actually make the industry go further to the right than it would to the left, because there's such a avid fan base that I legitimately think the companies would turn to fan fiction and fan art before they ever negotiated with actual talent.
No, I agree. It wouldn't actually in practice work at all, because 90% of the writers you have working right now are all freelance.
Yeah.
So there is really, they don't actually have any clout, but Marvel and DC abuse that.
No, totally. I don't know. You just got me thinking about it. I'm like, would it work? I'm like, no, probably not.
Definitely not. But that's the problem. The fact that workers could rally and try and break up the company, and the company still would not crumble, that's a problem.
Yeah. Oh, that's sad. No, it's like, all right. So I want to wrap this back because I do think that this whole topic of diversity of voices is very much connected to the concept of the old man stories, and I think we're all kind of universally like, yeah, it's a bit tired of a trope at this point. But I do want to give credit where it's due. I do want to give fairness where it's due, and just talk about what does work about these stories. What is good? What is worthwhile about these stories, despite the consequences they've had for the industry and the way in which they reflect a very particular voice, a very singular voice. What is worthwhile? What is good about them despite that?
I feel like I want to go to just two examples off the top of my head that are both Batman related, because I think he's the character that's directly the most tied to this idea. So like Dark Knight Returns, as it is and as it was, like we've had the idea that it suddenly made Batman dark is completely preposterous. We've had ideas for Batman being dark at the start, and then just after the Adam West series in the late 60s, we've had dark Batman stories again before the Dark Knight Returns came out. So that wasn't what it really changed. We were still doing that. What it did do, though, is it made Batman mythic. It gave Batman that kind of weight where him coming back was just too big. Like this was a worldwide event that everything came to it. Like by the end of the book, he's fighting down a literal god in a nuclear winter. Like it's insane, and that's one of the aspects of Batman that I think really has elevated the character moving forward. And I think it makes sense for his character because it shows you kind of the will of the human spirit triumphant kind of idea, and I think that's worth keeping. I think that's why these stories are kind of worthwhile, is it shows that even when your body, like it's the ultimate extent of the underdog story, where the character who is suddenly like beaten down by the enemy but somehow manages to win. This is the ultimate, they're not just beaten by the enemy, they are beaten down by their own body. They physically shouldn't be doing this anymore. They can't do this, but somehow they find a way to do it even better than they did even before. Like there's a weight to that, there's a power to that. And I feel like something that works with that maybe is, in the more recent example, is Scott Snyder's kind of doing his own version of this now with Batman Last Night on Earth, which is more so less Dark Knight Returns and more Mad Max. But it's interesting to see a completely different take on Batman's last story, where he isn't old even. He's just, everything else is old and everything else is dystopian, but Batman's still Batman. And how does he deal with that? And I think those kind of ways you handle the character let you, as a writer, strip down all the bullshit. If you just go to the end, you don't have to worry about keeping all the characters that you don't like around. You have to worry about the side characters. You don't have to answer all the questions. Okay, if you're going to do this giant epic story, where's the Joker? You're going to say, oh, he died. Like, you can just have the pieces you want to play with only there, and you can take them to whatever extreme you want them to be. If you wanted to do an end Superman story and he's a god, where he's literally the most powerful being in the universe, he's at the end of the universe, and he's completely golden, and he's everything, you can do that. But you can also do, he's old now, and he's just broken down, he's given up. Both those extremes are extremes you can play with that you wouldn't normally be able to do if you do like a present day story. So I think that's the main strength of them.
Steve, what about you? Since I think you're the most critical of these stories, what good do you see in them?
So, following up on Alfie's point, because that's fantastic, I like the opposite end of that worldview. So, when you do Dark Knight Returns and it becomes really, really mythic, and you do the Batman that's like the most exaggerated he can be, I like having that and then zooming down to the people that are seeing it. So, part of why Daredevil End of Days, I think, is so good and probably the best in this kind of genre is the story already happened, and the whole rest of the book is dealing with the people that knew him, the people that saw his life, the people that dealt with the fall, the people that were there, and how now without him, or now in a situation where he's not what he used to be, everyone has to deal with it in their own way, and they sort of paint their own picture of who they thought that character was. The best part about Watchmen for me is the parts in between the main story where that little kid is at the newsstand reading the comic as the world around him is ending. I think that's great. The best part about Logan is X-23. It's Laura. It's that Wolverine means something to her in a really particular way, and she's molding him to be that for her, and how she deals with it and where she gets at the end is the heart of that whole damn movie.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I tend to be kind of on both sides with you guys. I like all of that stuff. The idea of the legacy, the idea of passing on the good without the baggage, is something that I think is really important. You know, when you read these stories about superheroes in general, not just their final days kind of thing, I think it is really important to look at these characters, even though they are mythic, as flawed. Like, that's the best thing about Batman, is he's this really flawed human being, but he kind of knows that about himself, and yet he tries to be good anyway, and that's probably the more important part. And I think that's really interesting to follow. And so Dark Knight Returns is one of those books where, yeah, it gets really fascistic and it gets really power fantasy-ish at times, but there's also just this underlying notion in it of trying to say, no, everything's wrong, and I'm not going to sit on the sidelines anymore. I did it for a long time, I tried to be selfish, and now I just can't. And that's the only way to have a good death, is to not sit down and let it happen. To stand up and fight till my last breath. I think that is, you know, again, it's totally wrapped up in everything we were talking about with the idea of the midlife crisis and everything, but I do feel that is a really important message in that story that kind of gets lost in the, oh, it's so fucking dark and gritty. The rain on my chest is a baptism. You know, that shit. Like, I mean, you gotta give Frank Miller credit. You know, the one thing you can say about Frank Miller, love him or hate him, the dude knows how to write narration. It's great every time. It's so over the top, but it's so good.
Forgot that damn line.
It's there's so many of it. Face it, old man, you can't drown me in wine and women. God, Batman fucking talking to Bruce Wayne is my crack, dude.
What Frank Miller lacks in any sort of, let's say, elegance, he makes up for with really good sucker punches of dialogue.
Oh yeah.
Oh, so hard. Yeah, so like I really appreciate that side of those stories when they try to leave you with the positives while acknowledging the negatives, even if they can't do it well to some people. Because I mean, I read Dark Knight Returns when I was 18. I took the, oh, this is so badass, but then I kind of got over that part, and every time I go back to that story, I think of it in different ways now. I don't know. I feel that's an important thing to be able to do. I was going to conclude, but I think I want to bring up one more thing. And that is kind of the novel that's all about the idea of the maturity crisis, I guess I'd call it, because Frank Miller wrote a midlife crisis story, but it was read by teenagers and guys in their 20s, and so they were having a crisis of maturity. They're experiencing it vicariously through that. I feel the book that they should have read that would have satisfied a lot of the same urges, but done it with a much more clear message by the end of it, is A Clockwork Orange. Because, like, alright, I love A Clockwork Orange, the movie. It's one of Stanley Kubrick's best films. It is tragic that the original ending is not in that. So the book Clockwork Orange has this really weird release where the last chapter is taken out in the American release, and Stanley Kubrick's film is based on the American release. He never read the British release. So the last chapter of A Clockwork Orange, you can take everything that happens in the film up until Alex wakes up in the hospital. And you even get that. You even get the stuff where he wakes up in the hospital. But it doesn't end there. The last chapter, Alex is out living large, still doing ultra violence all over the streets, hurting people, beating them up, and he's got a crony of he's got a new gang of cronies of preteens and early teenagers, and he's like 18, 19 at this point. And he runs into his buddy Georgie, who used to be in his gang. And Georgie's like 23, 24. And he's got a girlfriend, and Alex goes up and tries to talk to Georgie, and he's using this really thick slang that's developed in Clockwork Orange. And Georgie's girlfriend says, "Oh my God, Georgie, did you used to talk like that too? Oh, that is so silly." And the whole point of that final chapter is Alex realizing in himself that he's aged out of this really immature, I like violence attitude, and yet he's still like stuck in it. And so he needs the mental maturity, too. I think that's the book those people should have read, because I had the weird distinction of reading that and then Dark Knight Returns. So, yeah, I think we just need to create a graphic novel adaptation of A Clockwork Orange and really make sure that last chapter's there and give it to everyone who took Dark Knight Returns way too seriously. And we'll start with Zack Snyder.
I have my issues with him, but I think the best video Patrick Willems ever did is the What If Zack Snyder Directed Literary Classics. That thing is hilarious, because just imagine the sort of like hardcore black and white lighting, beating the shit out of people, Frank Miller dialogue, and then you see the title card and it's like The Scarlet Letter.
It's scarlet because of the blood. Yeah. So I don't know. I think that's a good place to leave things. Everyone go read A Clockwork Orange. It's short. It's good. And you'll get all the violence that you want, and then you'll get nice resolution, and everyone will be happy, and the world will begin in peace. Yay. All right. Alfie, we need a review topic, I believe.
Yes, so this is kind of sort of the world going to shit, but not really. It's more different than everything else we're talking about, but I'm curious to see what you guys think of it, if you've seen it or not already. I kind of want to talk about Shaun of the Dead.
Okay.
Fun
times. All right. Everyone, thanks very much for watching. Catch you next week, where we'll be talking about Shaun of the Dead. We'll go meet up at the pub. Until then, I'm the Philosopher.
I'm a geek for fun.
And I'm the Steve.
And we are your geeky gentlemen. And we will be discussing things.